Don't talk to the old lady. She gets confused about everything. My daughter-in-law snapped at the hotel clerk while I stood less than 3 feet away holding my purse against my chest. The young woman behind the marble counter froze mid-sentence, her polite smile fading as she glanced nervously between Brianna and me. Around us, the hotel lobby glowed with warm amber light from crystal chandeliers, and somewhere nearby, soft piano music drifted through the air. People in expensive coats rolled polished suitcases across the stone floor, while the scent of cedarwood and fresh coffee lingered in the air. It should have felt elegant, relaxing, the kind of place my late husband would have admired. Instead, I felt something cold settle quietly into my stomach. Brianna adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored designer jacket and gave the clerk a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just give the room keys to me," she said. "My mother-in-law doesn't need all the details." I looked toward my son, hoping for even the smallest sign of discomfort on his face. Michael stood beside the luggage cart with one hand in his coat pocket, staring down at his phone as if none of this involved him. His silence hurt more than Brianna's words ever could. The clerk swallowed awkwardly before sliding the key cards toward Brianna. "Of course, ma'am." I smiled softly at the young woman because I could tell she was embarrassed for me. "It's all right," I said gently. "I'm sure she's just tired from traveling." Brianna let out a short laugh under her breath. "It's been a long day for all of us." I said nothing after that. At 68 years old, I had learned that humiliation often became louder when you tried to fight in public. So instead, I stood quietly in the center of that beautiful lobby while strangers pretended not to stare. Outside the towering glass windows, snow drifted slowly over the mountains of Aspen, covering the streets in white. 2 years earlier, my husband Walter had passed away after nearly 40 years of marriage. And since then, silence had become something I carried with me everywhere. Silence at the dinner table. Silence during holidays. Silence whenever. Brianna entered a room and somehow managed to make everyone else uncomfortable without raising her voice. When Michael invited me on this family vacation 3 months earlier, I honestly thought things might finally be changing. "You shouldn't spend Christmas alone again, Mom," he told me over the phone. "Come with us this year. Ethan would love having you there." I believed him because I wanted to believe him. I spent nearly $400 on winter clothes for the trip, including a new navy wool coat that still smelled faintly of the department store perfume counter. I even dug my old leather gloves out of storage because Walter had always loved those gloves on me. "You look classy in those," he used to say whenever we traveled together. Standing there in the lobby, clutching those same gloves in one hand, I suddenly realized something painful. This vacation had never really been about including me. The signs had started long before we reached Colorado. At the airport, Brianna had booked herself and Michael in first class while I sat alone 12 rows behind them in economy, beside a college student wearing headphones the entire flight. During our layover in Denver, Brianna walked so quickly through the terminal that I struggled to keep up with my carry-on suitcase rolling behind me. More than once, I noticed Ethan trying to slow down to walk beside me, only for Brianna to sharply call his name from ahead. "Stay with us, Ethan." Not Grandma. Us. Even the SUV ride from the airport to the resort, I felt strangely invisible sitting in the third row while Brianna and Michael discussed dinner reservations and ski schedules without once asking what I might enjoy doing. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself grief had simply made me sensitive. But standing in that hotel lobby while my daughter-in-law spoke about me as if I were a burden she'd been forced to manage, I finally understood the truth. This trip was not a gift. It was not a reunion. And whatever Brianna had planned for the next 10 days, I had the uneasy feeling I was only seeing the beginning of it. The elevator ride to the 18th floor felt longer than it should have. Brianna stood near the mirrored wall, scrolling through her phone, while Michael kept both hands in his coat pockets, staring silently at the glowing floor numbers above the doors. Ethan leaned against me sleepily, his small winter hat slipping halfway over one eye. He had turned 9 that fall, and despite everything happening around us, he still reached for my hand the same way he did when he was little. "Grandma, are you coming skiing with us tomorrow?" he asked quietly. Before I could answer, Brianna looked up from her phone. Your grandmother does not ski anymore, Ethan. Let her rest. There was something sharp in the way she said rest, as if she were describing someone fragile and outdated. Ethan frowned slightly. Grandma used to ski with Grandpa all the time. Brianna smiled without warmth. People slowed down. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and she stepped out first without another word. The hallway smelled faintly of pine wood and expensive cleaning products. Thick carpets muted the sound of our footsteps as we walked toward the suite. Through the tall windows at the end of the corridor, I could see snow falling steadily over the mountains, covering the pine trees in silver-white layers that shimmered beneath the resort lights. Walter would have loved this place. He always preferred quiet winter towns over crowded beaches. For a moment, I imagined him walking beside me with one hand resting gently against the small of my back the way he used to whenever we traveled together. That memory hit harder than I expected. Grief had a strange way of sneaking up on you in beautiful places. Brianna unlocked the suite door and immediately disappeared into the largest bedroom without saying anything. Michael carried the luggage inside, while I stood quietly near the fireplace, taking in the room. The suite was enormous, easily over 2,000 square feet, with vaulted ceilings, stone walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains. A decorated Christmas tree glowed softly near the dining area, already surrounded by wrapped gift boxes tied with satin ribbon. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. Your room is down the hall, Mom, Michael said, distractedly while setting suitcases near the kitchen island. I followed the hallway and opened the final door at the end. The room was much smaller than the others. One narrow bed, no fireplace, no balcony view. The window faced the parking garage. For several seconds, I simply stood there holding my coat over my arm. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I was too old to care about things like room assignments. But deep down, the ache still settled quietly into my chest, because this was exactly the kind of thing Walter never would have allowed. He used to say that respect showed itself in the smallest details. A chair pulled out for someone, a coat carried upstairs, a room with a nice view. Do you need help unpacking? Michael asked from behind me. His voice sounded careful, almost guilty. I turned toward him and smiled softly. I am fine. He nodded quickly, relieved by the easy answer. That was another thing grief had taught me. People preferred quiet pain because it required nothing from them. Later that evening, we went downstairs for dinner at the resort restaurant. The dining room glowed with candlelight and soft jazz music, while waiters moved between tables carrying trays of wine and steaming plates of steak. Families laughed beside enormous windows overlooking the snow-covered slopes. Everyone around us seemed warm and connected. Brianna spent most of dinner discussing ski lessons and spa reservations without including me once in the conversation. At one point, the waiter turned politely toward me. And for you, ma'am? Before I could answer, Brianna interrupted smoothly. She will just have the soup. Nothing too heavy this late. The waiter hesitated. Of course. I looked down at the menu still open in my hands. I had wanted the salmon. It sounded ridiculous, even to me, feeling hurt over something so small. But humiliation rarely arrived in large dramatic moments. Sometimes it came quietly, disguised as decisions made for you, while everyone else pretended it was kindness. Across the table, Ethan watched me carefully. Children always noticed more than adults realized. Underneath the white tablecloth, his small hand reached over and squeezed mine for just a second before pulling away again. And somehow, that tiny gesture almost broke my heart. The next morning, I woke before sunrise to the soft hum of the heating vents and the faint sound of snowplows somewhere below the parking garage outside my window. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then the unfamiliar room settled back around me, cold and quiet. I sat up slowly and wrapped my cardigan tighter around my shoulders while pale blue light crept through the curtains. Walter used to wake early on vacations. He would bring me coffee before I even opened my eyes, always with too much cream because he said life was bitter enough already. I stayed in bed a little longer thinking about that. Some memories still felt warm. Others felt like bruises. By 7:30, I was dressed and walking toward the main dining area downstairs. The resort restaurant overlooked the mountains, and the entire room glowed gold beneath hanging lantern lights, while snow continued falling outside the massive windows. Families gathered around large wooden tables in ski jackets and knitted sweaters, laughing over pancakes and hot chocolate. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine this trip becoming something peaceful after all. Maybe yesterday had simply been stress from traveling. Maybe I was overthinking things. Then I reached our table. There were only 3 place settings. Brianna sat beside the window, sipping coffee, while scrolling through her phone. Michael was reading something on his tablet. Ethan quietly stirred whipped cream into his hot chocolate. I stopped beside the table holding my tray. "Oh," Brianna said without looking up, "we already ordered because the ski shuttle comes early." Her voice carried that same polished sweetness that somehow managed to feel colder than open cruelty. Michael glanced up briefly. "I figured you might want to sleep in." It was 7:30 in the morning. For 40 years of marriage, Walter and I had never slept past 6:30 a single day in our lives. I smiled faintly and sat down anyway. That was thoughtful. Brianna finally looked at me. "We ordered oatmeal for you. The kitchen said it is heart healthy." Ethan frowned. "Grandma likes pancakes." Brianna gave him a warning look. "Oatmeal is healthier." The waitress arrived moments later carrying a bowl of plain oatmeal and a small cup of black coffee. "No cream, no sugar." I thanked her softly while Brianna returned to discussing ski schedules with Michael as though I were not sitting there at all. Halfway through breakfast, a woman in a Navy resort uniform approached our table with a bright professional smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper. I just wanted to confirm your spa reservation for tomorrow afternoon." Brianna looked up immediately. "There must be some mistake." The woman blinked. "I'm sorry. My mother-in-law does not have any spa appointments." The employee checked the tablet in her hands. "Actually, it was reserved under the family package yesterday evening." Brianna let out a small impatient sigh. "Well, cancel it. She will not need that." The woman hesitated politely before turning toward me. "Would you still like to keep the reservation, ma'am?" Before I could answer, Brianna spoke again. "Please stop asking her direct questions. It confuses her." Something in the restaurant shifted then. Not loudly, not dramatically, but I noticed the waitress standing nearby glance toward me with visible discomfort. I noticed Ethan staring down at his plate in silence. And for the first time since arriving in Aspen, I saw a genuine embarrassment cross Michael's face. Very quickly, he looked back down at his tablet again. I folded my napkin carefully beside my untouched oatmeal. "Actually," I said calmly, "I would love to keep the reservation." Brianna smiled tightly. "Evelyn, you hate spas." "No, irraplia souffle." Walter hated spas. I simply went along with whatever he preferred. For one brief second, Brianna looked caught off guard. The resort employee smiled politely. "Wonderful. We will keep your reservation for 2 o'clock tomorrow." After she walked away, silence settled over the table. Outside, snow drifted heavily against the windows while skiers moved like tiny shadows across the distant white slopes. Brianna picked up her coffee cup with controlled movements, but I noticed the tension in her jaw. Michael still would not. Meet my eyes. It struck me then how strange this entire trip truly was. Every decision seemed to pass through Brianna first. Every conversation stopped when I entered the room. Even simple things like breakfast or reservations somehow became battles over control. I looked around the beautiful restaurant filled with families enjoying their holiday together, and a quiet realization settled into my chest. I was not here as a guest. I was here as a problem they were trying to manage discreetly until they no longer had to. That afternoon, the snow finally stopped falling, leaving the mountains outside, sparkling beneath pale winter sunlight. From a balcony near the main lodge, the entire valley looked untouched and silent, as though the world itself had paused beneath the weight of fresh snow. Families moved across the resort carrying skis and shopping bags while children laughed near the outdoor fire pits roasting marshmallows. Everything looked warm from a distance. That was the strange thing about appearances. Sometimes the prettiest places held the coldest memories. I spent most of the afternoon alone wandering slowly through the resort village while Michael and Brianna went skiing. Ethan had wanted to stay with me, but Brianna insisted he needed family activities. The words lingered unpleasantly in my mind after they left. Family activities, as if I were somehow separate from the family itself. I stopped inside a small bookstore near the lobby and bought a hot chocolate. I did not really want just to sit somewhere quiet for a while. The shop smelled like cinnamon candles and old paperbacks. Soft jazz music played overhead while tourists browsed shelves filled with travel journals and holiday novels. Walter would have disappeared into a place like this for hours. He loved bookstores more than almost anything. I smiled faintly, remembering how he always carried reading glasses low on his nose whenever he traveled. People used to mistake him for a professor. "You should see your husband when he talks about history," I once overheard a waitress whisper to another employee years ago during a trip to Boston. "He sounds like he lived through half of it himself," he said, near the window, staring out at the snow-covered sidewalks while memories slowly drifted back one after another. Walter and I built our life carefully over 4 decades. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy. He started Harper Financial out of a cramped office above a hardware store when Michael was only 6 years old. I still remembered balancing our checkbook at the kitchen table, while Walter worked late into the night beside stacks of paperwork and cold coffee cups. There were years when we could barely afford family vacations at all. Years when Christmas gifts came from discount stores and every dollar mattered. But Walter never let me feel small because of it. Money changes people, he used to tell me quietly whenever business improved. Character is what matters after the money arrives. For a long time, Michael understood that too. Before Brianna entered our lives, my son used to call every Sunday morning without fail. He visited during holidays without being asked. He helped Walter repair the deck behind our house every summer, and sometimes the two of them stayed outside for hours talking while I brought lemonade through the screen door. Looking back now, the changes happened gradually, so gradually that I barely noticed them at first. After Michael married Brianna, dinners became shorter. Visits became rare. Holidays suddenly required careful scheduling. There was always a reason, always an explanation polished smooth enough to sound reasonable. Brianna had mastered that skill from the beginning. She never raised her voice in front of outsiders, never openly insulted anyone where it could make her look cruel. Instead, she operated quietly. Small comments, tiny exclusions, the kind of behavior that left you questioning yourself afterward. I remember the first Christmas after their wedding when she laughed lightly and said, "Evelyn still uses a flip phone." It is honestly adorable. Everyone chuckled politely while I smiled along, even though something about the comment embarrassed me. Another time, she changed the seating arrangement at Thanksgiving, so I ended up alone at the far end of the table beside the children. It just made more sense for her. Conversation flow, she explained sweetly afterward. Walter noticed it immediately. Later that night, while loading dishes into the dishwasher, he wrapped one arm gently around my shoulders and whispered, "Do not let her make you feel invisible." At the time, I brushed it off. Walter saw things I often refused to see. He understood people better than I did. A soft voice interrupted my thoughts. "Mrs. Harper?" I looked up to find the young resort employee for breakfast standing near my table holding a folder against her chest. Grace Miller. Her name tag glinted beneath the bookstore lights. She looked hesitant, almost nervous. "I hope I'm not interrupting you," she said carefully. "I actually needed to ask you something about your reservation." Something in her expression made the warmth slowly drain from my chest. I set down my cup quietly. "What is it?" Grace glanced toward the bookstore entrance, as though checking whether someone had followed her. Then she lowered her voice slightly. "I think there may have been a mistake with your booking information." Grace remained standing beside the small table near the bookstore window, holding the folder so tightly against her chest that the edges bent slightly beneath her fingers. Up close, she looked younger than I first thought. Maybe 27. Dark hair pulled neatly into a low bun, tired eyes, and the careful expression of someone trying not to overstep boundaries. I set my paper cup down slowly. "What kind of mistake?" I asked quietly. She hesitated before sliding into the empty chair across from me. I probably should not even be discussing this with you directly, she admitted softly. But after the way your family spoke to you earlier, something about the reservation details felt strange. My stomach tightened slightly. Outside the bookstore windows, people continued walking through the snowy village, carrying shopping bags and ski equipment, while Christmas music drifted faintly through the outdoor speakers. Everything beyond that glass looked cheerful and ordinary. Grace opened the folder carefully and glanced down at several printed pages. Your suite reservation only covers 2 nights, she said. For a moment, I simply stared at her. That cannot be right. The family reservation is booked for 10 days, she continued cautiously. But according to our system, your room is scheduled to expire Friday morning. Friday. It was only Wednesday afternoon. A strange calm settled over me then. Not shock exactly. Something colder, more familiar. The kind of feeling you get when a suspicion quietly turns into certainty. Maybe there was an error during booking, I said automatically, even though deep down I already knew there had not been any mistake at all. Grace nodded slowly, but her expression suggested she did not believe that either. There is something else. She turned one of the pages toward me. The notes attached to your reservation requested transportation to Denver International Airport Friday afternoon. 1 passenger only. I looked down at the paper without touching it. My own name stared back at me beneath the transportation request. A black SUV scheduled for 1 o'clock Friday. Suddenly, every strange moment since arriving in Aspen rearranged itself neatly inside my mind like puzzle pieces finally locking together. The separate airplane seats. The small room facing the parking garage. The way Brianna controlled every conversation. The constant references to rest and confusion and age. They had never planned for me to stay the entire vacation. They planned to send me home early while they continued the holiday without me. Grace lowered her voice further. I am very sorry, Mrs. Harper. I did not feel right ignoring it. For several seconds, I said nothing. I could hear pages turning somewhere near the back of the bookstore and the distant hiss of the espresso machine at the cafe counter. My hands rested calmly in my lap, even though my chest felt hollow. Walter used to say that betrayal rarely arrived suddenly. Usually it arrived slowly enough for people to explain it away until they no longer could. Did my son arrange this? I finally asked. Grace looked uncomfortable. The requests were submitted through Mrs. Hayes's email account. Brianna. Of course it was Brianna. Yet somehow that was not the part that hurt most. The real pain came from knowing Michael. Must have known. Maybe he did not create the plan himself. Maybe he simply allowed it to happen because resisting his wife had become more difficult than disappointing his mother. That realization cut deeper than anger ever could. Grace carefully closed the folder. There's another reason I came to speak with you. She reached inside and removed a smaller envelope. One of our concierge staff accidentally delivered this to the front desk instead of the penthouse suite earlier. I stared at the envelope. My name was not on it. Brianna's was. I should probably return it unopened, Grace said carefully. But after seeing your transportation request, I thought maybe you deserved to know something. She slid the envelope gently across the table toward me. Through the partially open flap, I could see the corner of a legal document inside. And across the top page, printed clearly in bold black letters, were words that made my pulse slow almost instantly. Assisted living evaluation authorization. For several long seconds, the bookstore around me seemed to disappear entirely. I looked down at the paper while an awful understanding settled quietly into place. This vacation was never about family healing. It was never about Christmas. Brianna had brought me to Aspen to begin removing me from their lives permanently, and somehow, somewhere along the way, my own son had allowed it to happen. I did not return to the suite immediately after Grace left the bookstore. Instead, I sat alone near the window long after my hot chocolate had gone cold, staring down at the envelope resting quietly beside my purse. Outside, the resort village had begun glowing beneath thousands of white Christmas lights as evening settled across the mountains. Couples walked arm in arm through the snow while children pointed excitedly toward the giant decorated tree near the skating rink. Somewhere nearby, church bells echoed softly through the valley. The entire town looked like the front of a holiday postcard. Yet sitting there beneath the warm bookstore lights, I felt strangely detached from all of it, as though I were watching someone else's vacation unfold from very far away. I finally picked up the envelope again and carefully slid the document out halfway. Assisted living evaluation authorization. My eyes moved slowly over the typed pages while a dull heaviness settled deeper into my chest. There were medical assessment sections, financial authorization sections, even transportation recommendations for transition support. Brianna had already filled out part of the paperwork. I recognized her handwriting immediately. Under emergency contact information, she had listed herself first. Michael second. My own name appeared lower on the page beneath the category current resident. Resident, not mother, not family. Resident. I folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the envelope before anyone could notice my hands trembling slightly. Walter warned me once, years ago, during a quiet conversation shortly after Michael married Brianna. We had been sitting on our back porch one summer evening watching fireflies drift across the yard while Michael and Brianna argued softly inside the kitchen about money. Walter rarely criticized people openly, but that night he looked unusually troubled. Brianna does not see relationships the same way we do, he told me quietly. She sees positions, advantages, control. I remember defending her immediately. I said she was ambitious, organized, protective of Michael. Walter only nodded slowly before taking another sip of iced tea. Maybe, he said, but watch carefully who benefits whenever decisions get made. I wished desperately now that I had listened more closely back then. By the time I finally returned to the suite, it was nearly 7 o'clock. Laughter drifted faintly through the hallway before I even opened the door. Inside, the fireplace glowed warmly, while Ethan sat cross-legged on the rug building something from a small box of toy bricks. Brianna stood near the kitchen island, pouring herself a glass of wine, while Michael scrolled through channels on the television. The room looked comfortable, ordinary, almost happy. Brianna glanced up first. "There you are," she said smoothly. "We were starting to wonder where you disappeared to." I removed my gloves slowly. "I spent some time at the bookstore." Michael looked relieved by the simple answer. "Did you have dinner already?" "Not yet." Brianna exchanged a quick glance with him before smiling again. "Well, we made plans for tomorrow while you were out." I felt my pulse slow slightly. "Oh." She leaned casually against the counter. "Michael and Ethan are going skiing all day, and I booked a wellness consultation for you tomorrow afternoon." Wellness consultation. Such polite words. So polished. So harmless sounding. I set my purse carefully onto the armchair beside the fireplace. "That sounds thoughtful." Brianna relaxed almost visibly at my calm response. "I knew you would appreciate it. They specialize in senior wellness planning and lifestyle transitions." Lifestyle transitions. Another polished phrase hiding something uglier beneath it. Ethan looked up from the floor suddenly. "Grandma, are you leaving Friday?" The room went completely still. Brianna answered too quickly. "Who told you that?" Ethan shrugged nervously. "I heard Dad talking on the phone earlier." Michael finally looked away from the television. For the first time since arriving in Aspen, he appeared genuinely uncomfortable. "Ethan," he said quietly, "why do not you go brush your teeth for bed?" Ethan glanced uncertainly between all of us before slowly gathering his toy bricks and disappearing down the hallway. The silence afterward felt heavy enough to touch. Brianna recovered first, her voice smooth again. "Children misunderstand things all the time." I looked directly at her then. Not angry, not emotional, simply observant. "Yes," I said softly. "Sometimes adults hope they will." For a brief moment, something flickered across Brianna's face. Not guilt, not embarrassment. Fear, small and quick, but unmistakable. And suddenly I understood something important. Brianna believed she was completely in control of this situation, which meant she still had no idea I already knew what they were planning. The next morning, I woke with an unusual sense of calm. Not peace exactly. Something sharper than that. The kind of calm that comes when confusion finally disappears and leaves only clarity behind. Snowlight filtered faintly through the curtains while the digital clock beside the bed read 6:15. For several moments, I lay still listening to the distant sounds of elevators moving through the hotel and muffled laughter echoing somewhere down the hallway. Then I sat up slowly and reached for my phone on the nightstand. There was only one person I wanted to speak to. Richard Bennett had been Walter's attorney for almost 20 years. He handled the business sale after Walter retired, helped structure the family trust, and attended Walter's funeral wearing the same gray wool coat he wore every winter. More importantly, Richard was one of the few people Walter trusted completely. I stepped quietly into the hallway outside my room before dialing his number. He answered on the third ring, sounding mildly out of breath. "Evelyn, I'm sorry to call so early. Do not apologize. Is everything all right?" I looked down the empty hallway toward the glowing elevator lights. "No," I admitted softly. "I think something is very wrong." Richard listened without interrupting while I carefully explained everything. The shortened reservation, the transportation request, the assisted living paperwork, Brianna's behavior, Michael's silence. I spoke calmly, almost clinically, because saying the details aloud somehow made the situation feel even colder than it already did inside my mind. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Evelyn," Richard finally said quietly, "did Michael ever discuss modifying the trust after Walter passed?" My stomach tightened immediately. "No," another pause. "About 6 months ago, Michael contacted my office requesting information about transferring management authority over portions of your financial accounts." I leaned slowly against the hallway wall. "What kind of authority?" "Residential assets, medical discretion, long-term care oversight." My fingers tightened around the phone. "Did you approve it?" "Absolutely not." His voice hardened slightly. "Walter's trust specifically prevents any transfer of control without your direct written consent and independent legal review." I closed my eyes briefly. Walter, even now, 2 years after his death, he was still protecting me. Richard lowered his voice. "I did not tell you at the time because Michael claimed Brianna was simply exploring future planning options. But honestly, something about the request bothered me. Future planning, another polished phrase, another way of disguising control as concern. There is something else you should know," Richard continued carefully. "Last month, Brianna contacted my assistant asking questions about selling your house." My eyes opened immediately. "My house?" She implied you were considering downsizing after the holidays. For several seconds, I could not speak. The house Walter and I built together still smelled faintly like cedarwood and coffee in the mornings. Every corner of it carried 40 years of memories. The thought of Brianna discussing its sale behind my back felt strangely intimate, almost invasive. "I never authorized anything," I said quietly. "I know." Richard exhaled heavily. "Evelyn, I think you need to be extremely careful." Walter anticipated the possibility of financial pressure after his death more than once. That surprised me. Walter rarely spoke openly about fears. "What do you mean?" 2 months before he passed away, he added additional legal protections to the trust. He specifically instructed that no one besides you could alter your residential or medical status without independent evaluation from his office. I stared silently through the hallway windows at the snow-covered mountains beyond the resort. Walter knew, maybe not every detail, but somewhere deep down, he knew exactly what kind of future Brianna might create once he was gone. Richard's voice softened slightly. "You are not powerless here, Evelyn." For the first time since arriving in Aspen, something shifted quietly inside me. Not anger, not revenge, just certainty. Brianna believed age had made me weak because she confused kindness with helplessness. Walter never made that mistake. "Do not confront them yet," Richard advised carefully. "If they think you suspect something, they may move faster." I glanced toward the suite at the far end of the hallway, where my son still slept beside the woman carefully dismantling his family piece by piece. "No," I said, softly. "I do not think they realize I am paying attention anymore." After ending the call, I stood there alone for another minute, watching snow drift slowly beyond the windows. Then I slipped my phone back in my pocket and walked calmly toward the elevator, because for the first time since this vacation began, I finally understood something important. Brianna was not preparing for my future. She was preparing for my removal. That evening, the resort hosted a private Christmas dinner in the grand ballroom overlooking the mountains. Gold candlelight flickered across crystal glasses while a string quartet played softly near the enormous stone fireplace at the far end of the room. Guests arrived dressed in cashmere coats and dark formal wear, shaking snow from their boots before stepping into the warmth inside. The entire ballroom smelled faintly of pine branches, red wine, and expensive perfume. Brianna loved places like this because appearances mattered deeply to her. Elegant spaces made polished lies easier to believe. I took extra time getting ready alone in my room that evening. I wore a dark emerald dress Walter once bought me during a trip to Chicago years earlier, along with the pearl earrings he gave me on our 35th wedding anniversary. Looking at myself in the mirror, I realized something surprising. I did not look weak. Tired perhaps. Older certainly, but not weak. When I entered the ballroom, Brianna immediately noticed the dress. Her smile tightened almost invisibly. "Well," she said lightly as Michael pulled out my chair at the table, "someone looks very formal tonight." I smoothed my napkin across my lap calmly. Walter always believed holidays deserved respect. Across the table, Michael looked down at his wine glass without speaking. Ethan smiled at me immediately. "Grandma looks prettier than everyone here," he announced proudly. Brianna laughed softly. "That is very sweet, Ethan." But something in her voice sounded distracted. Nervous, perhaps. During dinner, conversation floated around skiing conditions, stock markets, private schools, and holiday travel plans. Brianna moved through every discussion effortlessly, charming the other guests. With polished stories and careful laughter. Watching her, I finally understood why so many people missed her cruelty entirely. Brianna never behaved like a villain in obvious ways. She behaved like someone quietly reorganizing a room while pretending nothing had changed. Halfway through the main course, a waiter approached our table carrying a sealed cream-colored envelope. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely, placing it beside Brianna's wine glass. "This was delivered for you from the concierge desk." Brianna frowned slightly before opening it. The change in her face happened almost instantly. Not dramatically, just a subtle draining of color beneath her makeup. Her eyes moved quickly across the page and sighed, while Michael glanced toward her with confusion. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Brianna folded the paper too quickly. "Nothing important." But I already knew what she had received because Richard called me an hour earlier. He had officially frozen all trust modification requests connected to Walter's estate pending legal review. Brianna's attempt to gain authority over my medical and residential decisions had triggered an automatic investigation clause Walter added shortly before his death. She had not expected that. "Actually," I said softly while lifting my water glass, "I imagine it is fairly important." Brianna's eyes snapped toward me. The ballroom suddenly felt quieter, though the music still played softly in the background. Michael looked slowly between both of us now. "Mom." I met his gaze evenly for the first time since arriving in Aspen. "Did Brianna tell you she contacted Richard Bennett about moving me into assisted living?" The words landed heavily against the table. Michael stared at me in complete confusion. "What are you talking about?" Brianna recovered quickly. "Evelyn, this is not the place." "No," I agreed calmly. The place would have been discussing it with me before filing paperwork behind my back. Michael turned sharply toward his wife. "Paperwork." Brianna's composure cracked slightly then. "Michael, I was only trying to prepare for the future. By arranging transportation to send my mother home early?" I asked quietly. Ethan stopped eating entirely, his small eyes moving anxiously between us. Around the ballroom, nearby conversations had begun fading as people subtly noticed the tension at our table. Brianna lowered her voice urgently. "You are twisting everything." "Am I?" I reached into my purse slowly and placed the assisted living authorization form gently onto the white tablecloth between us. Michael stared down at the document, as though it had appeared from nowhere. "What is this?" he whispered. Brianna looked genuinely panicked now. "Michael, listen to me." But he was no longer looking at her. His eyes remained fixed on the paperwork while understanding slowly spread across his face piece by piece. I watched my son realize, perhaps for the very first time, just how much had been happening around him while he chose silence over attention. And for once, Brianna no longer looked like the person in control of the room. For several long seconds, nobody at the table moved. The string quartet continued, playing softly near the fireplace while waiters carried trays of wine between glittering tables around us. But inside that small space beneath the ballroom lights, everything had changed. Michael stared at the paperwork in front of him as though he no longer recognized the woman sitting beside him. Brianna's face remained perfectly composed from a distance, but I could see the panic gathering behind her eyes now. The performance was slipping. "Michael," she said carefully, lowering her voice, "I was trying to protect your mother." He finally looked up at her. "From what?" Brianna opened her mouth, then hesitated just long enough for the silence to answer the question itself. Michael picked up the authorization form slowly. "You filed this without telling me." "I discussed it with you," she replied quickly. "Not like this." His voice sounded quieter than I expected. Not angry. Worse. Disappointed. Brianna glanced around the ballroom, suddenly aware that nearby guests had begun pretending not to listen. "Can we please not do this here?" I folded my hands calmly in my lap. "You brought me here to discuss my future without my consent. This seems as appropriate a place as any." Across the table, Ethan looked frightened and confused. I reached over gently and touched his hand. "It is all right, sweetheart." Michael lowered the paperwork slowly. "The transportation request," he said carefully to Brianna. "The shortened reservation. Was it your idea too?" Brianna exhaled sharply. "Michael, your mother cannot live alone forever. Someone needed to start making practical decisions." "Practical," he repeated quietly, as though testing the word for the first time. I watched something painful settle across my son's face then. Not just realization, recognition. He was finally seeing years of small moments all at once. The interrupted conversations, the canceled visits, the holidays I quietly spent alone, the careful ways Brianna always positioned herself between him and everyone else who loved him. Brianna straightened in her chair, her voice gaining firmness again. "You are acting like I committed some terrible crime when I was trying to prepare for the inevitable." "The inevitable?" Michael asked. "Mom getting older." "Everyone gets older," I said softly. "That does not mean they stop being human." The words landed harder than I intended. Brianna looked away first. For the first time since I met her, she had no polished response ready. Michael slowly pushed his chair back from the table and stood up. "I need some air." Brianna reached for his arm immediately. "Michael, please." But he stepped away before she could touch him and disappeared toward the ballroom exit without another word. Ethan glanced nervously between us. "Can I go with Dad?" "Of course," I told him gently. After he hurried away, silence settled over the table once more. Brianna sat very still across from me, while candlelight flickered against the untouched wine in her glass. Without Michael beside her, she suddenly looked smaller somehow, less certain. "You think you won something tonight?" she finally said quietly. I met her gaze evenly. "No, I think I finally stopped losing." Her expression hardened slightly. "You do not understand how difficult it has been." "No, irraplia souffli." "I understand perfectly. That is the problem." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Around us, the ballroom slowly returned to normal as guests resumed conversations and music drifted gently through the air once more. Brianna stared down at the paperwork beside her plate before speaking again. "Walter never trusted me." I thought about that carefully before answering. Walter trusted behavior. She gave a bitter laugh under her breath, but there was no confidence left in it now. Only exhaustion. I stood slowly from the table and picked up my purse. "I will be leaving tomorrow morning," I said calmly. Brianna looked surprised. "You are still leaving?" "Yes." I slipped my coat over my shoulders while snow drifted softly beyond the tall ballroom windows. "The difference is that now it will be my decision." I walked through the glowing resort lobby alone later that night, while guests laughed beside the fire pits outside and Christmas music echoed faintly through the halls. Near the front entrance, I noticed Michael standing silently beside the massive windows overlooking the snow-covered mountains. He turned when he heard my footsteps. For a moment, he looked exactly like the little boy who used to wait beside the front door whenever Walter came home from work. Lost, ashamed, unsure how to fix something already broken. "Mom," he said quietly. I stopped beside him, but neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he lowered his eyes. I should have paid attention sooner. The honesty in his voice hurt more than excuses would have. I reached up gently and adjusted the collar of his coat the same way I had done when he was a child. "Yes," I said softly. Snow continued falling peacefully outside, while the mountains disappeared beneath the darkness beyond the glass. Then I turned and walked toward the elevators without anger, without tears, and without looking back, because age had not made me invisible after all. It had simply taught me how to recognize people clearly once they finally stopped pretending.